his like main advisor said, we can't criminalize people for being poor or Black, but we can criminalize their like common pleasures, basically. And so there's just kind of a lot of evidence that these were policies really more for social control, and there's never really about making the drugs illegal.
Welcome to the Multiverse, where we believe that mushrooms can actually change the world, and that if humans mirrored the magic and wisdom of the fungi kingdom, we would have a far more joyous and connected planet. Each week, we'll be meeting with thought leaders and experts to extract the best insights and stories across everything from functional fungi, psychedelic medicine, and so much more. Thanks for listening. Step into the multiverse with us. Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Into the Multiverse. This conversation has been a long time coming. I'm so excited that today I have Natalie Ginsberg on the podcast, and there's a lot of things that you have created in the world, which I'm so excited to share. I would like to read a bio that I read online and have you speak to it. And I want to get into your story, and there's so much that I want to cover. I wish that we would have recorded some of our conversation before we started recording, as it goes. But first of all, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm so happy to be here. It's just so special to be able to have so many. I know we have so much to talk about. So
there's a lot to cover. We won't get to any of it. As per usual, I've written down a ton of questions. We'll probably get to 3 or 4, and we'll just go on some tangents. But by way of introduction, Natalie has co-founded the Policy and Advocacy Department at MAPS, served as its director for 5 years. She also initiated and helped develop MAPS Health Equity Program. Before joining MAPS in 2014, Natalie worked as policy fellow at the Drug Policy Alliance, where she helped legalize medical cannabis in her home state of New York and worked to end New York's race-based marijuana arrest. And obviously, there's a lot there that we can dive into, but one of my favorite things to look at when people are coming on the show is look at their LinkedIn profile and figure out where they started and figure out where, how and why, and like what were the steps to close the gaps from where you started to where you are now. So one of the first things on your LinkedIn profile is that you were a fashion intern at Vogue. And now you are the global impact officer at one of the most well-known psychedelic organizations in the world. So take us back. How did you close the gap?
I'm laughing because I'm so grateful. I actually was just meeting with a CEO of a big fashion company yesterday, and my mom was laughing, and she was like, "See, you're not that far from Vogue now, because right now psychedelic fashion is such a thing." So I've been able to kind of re-engage. But yeah, I did and still do love fashion, and I see that as such an important way for people to express themselves and communicate with each other and connect to other, times or family members. But, I was really lucky to have that experience at Vogue at a young age as an intern, as an unpaid intern, so I was really lucky to be able to do that. And as much as I enjoyed my time there, it actually literally made me want to become a social worker. So it was really interesting. I learned a lot, but was kind of a little upset by how people treated each other at just in general in fashion. There's just such a kind of a lack of care around like well-being and work-life balance and all of that. But yeah, so after that, I'd kind of always been working in issues around racial justice and mass incarceration. So in college, I volunteered in a maximum security prison and was kind of learning more about our systems of mass incarceration and how fucked up they were. And that actually led me to want to become a public defender. And I thought that it would make sense to intern for the Brooklyn DA's office because I wanted to see the other side before I was a public defender. So I spent a summer working at the Brooklyn DA's office, and the majority of the cases we received were of 13, 14-year-old Black boys arrested for crumbs of marijuana. And meanwhile, I'd be meeting my friends from Yale to smoke weed after my day was done. And, some of their parents were judges at the court. It was just really striking. And so that kind of really made me frustrated with the whole system and not even necessarily wanting to work directly in that system. And so that kind of drew me more to social work. I was also just interested when I was at the DA's office. People would call to report crimes, and I'd end up like talking to them way longer than I was supposed to. And I was like, oh, maybe I'm interested in this like holding space, kind of therapeutic side of things. And then I went to social work school after graduation. I took a year in between, but yeah, and that experience was really profound for me. My first year, I was placed as a guidance counselor at a middle school in the South Bronx, and I worked with middle school kids who were highly traumatized, just experiencing like such horrific experiences. You know, walking to school, being like thrown against the wall by police for like no reason, like literally like a 12-year-old kid just walking to school, just getting like beat up by the police. And that's probably just, the smallest like thing that they're encountering. And my work that year made me kind of realize quickly that, like, though of course there were like kind of individual traumas that everyone experiences, I saw that so much of what they were facing stemmed from like these systemic injustices and really problematic policies that were making it impossible for them to like not experience these traumas. So that got me interested in drug policy reform, because I saw drug policy as such a like leading driver of mass incarceration, and how kind of racistly it was applied. And also I kind of did some, social work supported me doing powerful calculations about and like analysis of where kind of I sat in the world, and recognizing that I had the ability to put on pearl earrings and go lobby and talk to politicians in a way that maybe not everyone had the same access to. And I felt like that was kind of, it just kind of felt calling to me. And so I was lucky enough to then work that next year in social work school with the Drug Policy Alliance. And they're just doing such phenomenal work ending the war on drugs and changing our conception around drugs. And even now, how the general public has this understanding of like the racist way that marijuana was enforced, that really came from like Drug Policy Alliance, like working with a researcher to do that research, and then doing media campaigns and like hiring graphic artists to like make up graphics and pitch stories. And so it was really cool for me to kind of see the progression of how that works and how you really can impact the public discourse on a topic. So that was a really amazing experience. And my supervisor was Cassandra Frederick, who's now the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance. And she was really, I learned so much from my year with her and from everyone I worked with there. And yeah, in that time, I started reading about MAPS's work and psychedelic research in general. And something was just really intriguing to me, because in social work school, we were being told like something like addiction, people have their whole life and you work to manage it with them. And then I was reading these studies with psychedelics that in 3 sessions, people no longer had PTSD or addiction, and so something just really like resonated with me. Like, this must be kind of addressing the root source of these traumas and not just the symptoms. And so that really intrigued me. I actually, besides cannabis, which I have a beautiful relationship with, I actually hadn't really had a strong psychedelic experience before starting MAPS. So that was interesting, because a lot of people come to MAPS having their own like deeply profound psychedelic experience. But I was like, the research, guys, looks so interesting. And as a therapist, but luckily I reached out to MAPS, and they needed help. Rick needed help on his policy work, because most of MAPS is focused on our MDMA research. And luckily, it was just the right time, and I was able to join and found the policy team there. And it's been a really special ride since then. I joined in 2014, and we were around 14 people, and now we're almost 200, I think, with contractors and different organizations. Wow. And we've gone through a lot of exciting change, which I'm happy to get into. But yeah, that's kind of my little roundabout story, my way to how I got from Vogue, I guess, to here. But I guess to end with, after policy director, after 7 years, I took a sabbatical and came back as global impact officer, because, getting to this root source of things, I was realizing, talking to legislators and politicians, they would like cite Law and Order episodes about like as a way of understanding drugs instead of our research. So I decided I really just felt called to be kind of working on this like cultural impact level of like how is our society as a whole like speaking about these substances and understanding drugs. So that did kind of lead me back to fashion in some ways.
Yeah, there's so many things that I want to talk about with what you just said. One of our mutual friends who I love so much, Lauren Taus, and I know she's like a super, dear like best friend of yours as well. And
Absolutely, soul sister.
yeah, and my conversations with her, when I first basically got exposed to Carl Hart's work, I came to her and I was like, oh my God, like I totally understand why you resonate so much with him and everything he's talking about. And he wrote this book, Drug Use for Grownups, which blew my mind open about drug policy and the way, and all of the racial injustice that's going on with the way that policy is being made around drugs and how it's just pushing down, systemic issues that are happening. And it's I do a poor job of like summarizing it, but I talk about this book a lot. My whole team is reading it right now because I think it's so important because it's just the root of so many things. And whether it's that book or just your own perspective on the space, can you just give like a quick like high level like what is happening with drug policy, whether it's from your experience the prison system or just your own research and stuff, but I just think it's like really important for people to know. I know you can't really summarize it, but I would love you to try and kind of give like a high level of what's happening.
Sure. And I'll also, so Carl Hart's book is an amazing thing to read. And I'd also recommend a book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. That was kind of one of the first books to really powerfully make the case around kind of the massive racial kind of disparity in drug policy and mass incarceration. Um, yeah, so drug policy, I mean, I actually studied history in college. And when you really look into the history of drug prohibition, there's very direct and obvious connections with extremely racist ideologies. Almost every single drug law was justified by people in power, politicians with racist rhetoric. One of the first, the first drug law we like can find on the records was actually tied to the times of the Spanish Inquisition when they came to the so-called New World and saw indigenous communities working with what they called peyote was what was first prohibited. And, they saw it as people like communing with the devil. And so they immediately like criminalized it and vilified it. And then, hundreds of years later in the US, the first law on the books in California was around opium prohibition. And that was when there was a big influx of immigrants from China that came in to work on the railroads. And so it was like directly connected to these Chinese men using opium. And then, fast forward to cannabis, it was connected to Mexican Americans and cocaine connected to Black Americans and like really egregious things. If people are interested in looking more into it, I'd Google Harry Anslinger, who is a powerful person in the U.S. He was like the first person to kind of instigate the marijuana prohibition, and he just said some like really horrific things about the substances. Yeah, and even if you go fast forward a bit more to Nixon, he's on tape saying some horrific things about Jewish people and Black people and hippies and like saying we knew we couldn't criminalize. His like main advisor said, we know we can't criminalize people for being poor or Black, but we can criminalize their like common pleasures, basically. And so there's just kind of a lot of evidence that these were policies really more for social control. And there's never really about making the drugs illegal because like people with money and power and white folks in the U.S. have used all of these substances with far, far lower rates of arrest or criminalization, So there really have been tools for criminalizing certain communities rather than actually eradicating these substances, which, are more used than ever and problematic substance use and addiction rates are really high. So clearly this approach of prohibition has not been very effective. And the rates of mass incarceration in the U.S. were really exacerbated a lot in the 80s and 90s alongside the kind of ramp up of the war on drugs and criminalization of Black communities in particular, and certainly all non-white communities in the U.S. So, yeah, I guess that's kind of the like really big picture, but I really think it's essential for people who are engaged at all in psychedelics to really take it upon themselves to educate themselves and their community about this broader context of the war on drugs, and not to think like psychedelics are just kind of this special drug and they're a good drug and these other drugs are bad drugs, because the reality is all of these substances can be really powerful medicines and can be really dangerous, and it's really about how we interact with them. And many of these are sacred plant medicines that have been used for thousands of years around the world, like opium or heroin and coca leaves and all of these substances. So tobacco even. So I think it's really essential, because I see a lot like in psychedelic advocacy, people do tend to like distance themselves, and that just is really problematic for a lot of reasons, and also doesn't serve the psychedelic goal, because it's the same kind of framework, right? Like once you start understanding that psychedelics aren't really what you learned, if you kind of keep that mindset, that open mind with other substances, you'll kind of find the same thing, and these categories kind of start to dissolve. Yeah, and I think that's just really important for like folks working on like decriminalization to keep in mind. I was super excited in Oregon that they passed legislation to decriminalize all substances, not only psychedelics. But it's interesting that people speak way more about the psilocybin piece that passed, which is also incredibly exciting. Not to take away from that, but I just hope that the psychedelic community can kind of like hold this broader piece of context, because when we talk about set and setting, cultural set and setting, that's like such a key element of.
I think that was such an amazing summary. And one of the things though that was mind blowing to me when I was reading Drug Use for Grown-ups, Carl Hart's book, was that he broke down in deep detail exactly what you're talking about, and then he went into the actual effects of these substances on your brain, and went into all of the research and studies. And like he started out his work trying to prove the negative effects of drugs on crime rates, like to actually prove, the opposite of what he now spends his life's work advocating for. And that part was wild, because if people would actually understand how any of these substances in isolation apart from other like severe mental health issues actually affect your brain and neuronal structure, it would just be a totally different conversation. And I think the hurdle that we're facing, like why, for example, like I talk about mushrooms mostly, like that is definitely my world, but it's easier for people to kind of get behind mushrooms because number one, once you start to like open the door of people understanding functional mushrooms, they're like, okay, they're not so scary. And then psilocybin can be a better part of that conversation. But to go from that to like heroin is such a different ball game. And for even me, like I after now reading the book, like my mind is very different after understanding a lot of these substances. But I definitely grew up with people that had, I know a lot of people that have died from overdosing. I'm from Missouri. That's actually, there was like a specific area where a lot of people overdosed and died from these substances. So it's a stretch for me to understand it. But now actually reading the research, I'm like, wow, like it wasn't the actual substance. It's the education and like the cross-contamination and the dosing and all the other mental health issues that are present when that substance is introduced. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Totally. No, I think that's so important. And so many people, myself included, had so much stigma associated with a lot of these substances. And we, with good reason, trust our medical system more. So when heroin is given to us in a prescription pill, that feels like safer sometimes. Or, we have, Adderall is, I think Carl says, similar to meth in a lot of ways, right? And that
like one molecule off.
We can give that to our children really easily, but then the idea of meth is like really scary and stigmatized. So I think it is just part of this bigger process of like asking people to really like people know, like it's not, and seeing, unfortunately, with the opiate crisis, I think that really allowed people to examine their trust in some of these institutions that they did just trust, like that it was somehow different if a doctor was giving it to them or conceptually. But yeah, I think it's all part of the process. I think a big part of it comes with like non-judgment and compassion and like listening to folks who use substances and why, and understanding also even folks that are using in a problematic way, especially those folks that are using to medicate a lot of pain and because they don't have other ways to do that or haven't been able to make that change if that's what feels right for them. But yeah, I guess I see a lot of learning happening though, because people like Carl are brave enough to also speak about his own use. And I think that was really powerful because though a lot of people can speak about like the science of things, I think it's still a lot harder for people to be open about their drug use when it's not about psychedelics or cannabis. And I think it's going to probably take more people being open about the different ranges of substances and how they use them to help people understand the different ways of using these substances. But yeah, and I guess another piece of that to me is really like tracing the histories of the substances and how they're used in different cultures. And I think that also can kind of take away or like kind of expand your understanding and feeling about different substances. I think tobacco is a really interesting one because tobacco kills more people than all drugs combined, actually. So there's definitely a lot
Wow.
of harm, tobacco impacts in our society. And there's a lot of traditions, indigenous traditions, where tobacco is used in really sacred ways. And kind of understanding that again, it's like, is it the tobacco or is it how we engage with tobacco? If we're like smoking packs and packs a day, that are made with chemicals and other things, and kind of just yeah, there's just kind of always more to dive into. So I guess that's kind of a lesson, getting to like the root, what's really going on underneath.
2 points on this is one, when I was introduced to cannabis in high school, just like a brief personal story side note, and then we'll bring it back. But I was introduced to cannabis in like a really now reflecting on it, healthy way, in the sense of like we would smoke and go bike riding and like go out and adventure, and it was like a beautiful we would go like explore the woods of Missouri, and it was a really beautiful, like healthy way to connect with nature. It was wonderful. And then I came into college version of cannabis, and it was like bongs and like just getting just so high. And it was just like I had such an aversion to it. And just pointing to the difference of like how that was introduced to me, and how beautiful of an experience it was and how mind-opening. And then a totally different way to engage in it with I didn't connect with as much. So brief side note on that. And then I was reflecting on it, and I was looking around the people in college, and like everyone that smoked weed was really lazy, like really lazy. And then I was like, oh, well weed, everyone was like, well, weed makes you lazy. And then knowing my experience from high school and looking at the people that, they're these massive adventurers, just like the most go-getters ever. I was like, does weed make you lazy, or do lazy people smoke weed? And that's kind of the question around like any of these substances. Like, are we more drawn, when you have mental health issues, you're more drawn, like exactly like you said, to use the, engage in substance abuse. But its correlation is not causation. And that was just like a huge thing for me to understand. And I think if more people would look at the underlying, thing there, it's not the substance. It obviously adds to the issue, but it's like pouring water into a leaky bucket,
Totally.
So
I have to say, I
yeah.
just saw this article published yesterday debunking the lazy stoner stereotype.
Oh,
And
you
it
sent
like
it to
there's
me.
some interesting survey, but basically found that people who smoke weed are no less like motivated than people who do, and in fact a little more motivated in some ways. But I think it still speaks to what you're saying. There's a lot about the context, the mindset, and like how you approach it, and it absolutely makes a big difference. But cannabis in particular, I have a very similar experience where it's like pretty activating for me.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think it's important to kind of continue showing up, like even with TV and movies, like for so long there was this kind of lazy stoner type always featured sitting on the couch eating Doritos
Yep.
energy, but now cannabis is shown in so many other ways. And I remember on Broad City when I first saw them smoking a joint to like figure out the answer to something. They were like in a, something
Mhm.
bad happened. They're like, let's smoke a joint and like figure out what to do. I was like, yes, like that's, how you can
Creative,
use
yep.
use smoking weed like that. So I think we were like seeing that shift a little bit, I hope, but that's where I think it is really important to have those different contexts for psychedelics and all substances to help people see and ways of doing that responsibly. Like that's a really important element.
Yeah, and so another point on this that you kind of touched on, but I want to expand on because I think it's really important. And when I was preparing for this interview, I was listening to another one of your interviews and kind of reading the show notes through it, and you were talking around the idea that if you have the privilege to speak openly about your drug use, then you should. And I get questions all the time. I actually got a call from someone yesterday, like pretty big name investor, like, well-known person. And he's like, I'm looking for a way to share about, he's super passionate about microdosing, macrodosing, like psychedelics are a huge part of his wellness routine, which I believe in sharing openly about. But he's like, how do I start to speak about this in a way where I'm not going to get myself in trouble legally? Like he was kind of asking me for advice on it. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting question. I think platforms like this are amazing because people can kind of come out of the psychedelic closet in an intentional way. And hopefully also in supporting other initiatives, whether it be like a MAPS or we have a nonprofit that's focused on, the future of microdosing. And any thoughts on that? And also, is there any guidelines that you would give to people? Let's say it's someone that has a platform. Are you recommending that everyone that has a platform that uses psychedelics speak about it? And if so, how?
Well, first, I think it's really important people do like what feels right, even though, I have probably said and do think if people like have the safety to be able to do that, I kind of invite them to like reflect into how to use that platform. But maybe the most effective way to use that platform isn't to be like super
Mm.
open, but is to like kind of be a bridge in some other way. Um, I know some folks that are not able to be public on their platform, but are speaking a lot to people in their like closer circles, and that's a really impactful way to move, like to start speaking to colleagues, to family members, to friends. Like that might feel like not such a big impact, but that's actually the way that people are most likely to be open to things if someone they know and trust tells them about it.
Mhm.
So really to start like at that level. But yeah, if people feel comfortable and have a platform, I do think it's important. I mean, I think there's also a responsibility when people start speaking about it to then be informed and be like a responsible source of education, because people will start asking questions and will start reaching out. And then inevitably, you're going to be kind of holding space for a lot of folks or being kind of a connector. So I think that's something not to take lightly. But if people are in a process themselves of like learning and engaging, I think it's really beautiful to be able to share that with as many other people as they can,
Mhm.
in ways that feel in alignment and safe and responsible for them. But I think in terms of like, you mentioned someone who's like a prominent investor, like, I mean, of course, it depends on where he's working and a million things where he lives, but there's a lot of, places in California, there are places where there's a lot of spaciousness around speaking generally about things where, there's a decriminalization in certain cities. There's places you can go, where it's legal in other countries. So I think it's not quite like it used to be that mentioning something means you automatically did something illegal if you talk about
Mhm.
your ayahuasca experience. So I think there's a lot more space now. And so that's like kind of inviting people to like be brave if they feel that it's safe to kind of step into that space where it's might be a little uncomfortable. Maybe some people will ask them about it that like they might fear, but in my experience of 8 years at MAPS and even more in drug policy, almost everyone that was really skeptical at the beginning has fully come around. It took maybe years of asking questions and learning, but yeah, I think just kind of trusting in that process and this forward motion, and that it really depends on a lot of people being able to do that. And honestly, there are so many places. There's hundreds of companies right now that are working in psychedelics. There are a few that are publicly traded, and more every day. There legislation moving forward in many different states. I think, yeah, it's really there. It feels like there's an openness, and of course, that's different than like a firm legality. And so that's why there are also many people who like really cannot speak about, this and really would jeopardize like literally like losing their children or like really horrific consequences. So it's sometimes hard for people to remember that. I actually have a dear friend who, like, lives in California and works in the hospital system where people are still drug tested for cannabis. And you can lose your nursing license for smoking weed in California currently. You can take all their prescription pills, other different things, but you want to use cannabis. So people kind of forget like the different levels of how few people actually do have that space to talk in that way. I think a lot of people who have the ability to still feel scared, and I don't know. For me, it was a process of like doing that kind of fuller analysis and understanding. Yeah.
There's we were just speaking about this at an event that we hosted around this duality of like we're on a panel talking around how microdosing has impacted our mental health. And then simultaneously in Indiana, there's this woman named Jessica Thornton. I'm sure you've heard about this case. She's a mom. She's has 5 kids. She's a nurse. And she was arrested for personal use, creating her own personal microdosing capsules. Someone at her, I guess, at her hospital turned her in and is facing up to 10 years in jail for taking care of her mental health, essentially. So we're, over here in California talking, praising the use of microdosing. I can't even, it's countless, we estimate like 1,000 brands, like consumer brands that are being shipped all across the United States. And it's helping so many people. And then simultaneously you have the most regressive drug policy. And like exactly what you were saying, it's the same concept of, you have like young 13, 14-year-old boys that were arrested for like, minimal amounts of cannabis. And then you go and basically like smoke weed with like wealthy people that don't have to face those same problems. So there's like a huge acknowledgement of that. And I do think, what you said maybe is kind of the answer. And maybe that's how I'll answer it to people going forward. But like, if you are in a place where the risk is minimal as far as like, and the elements to consider, of course, like your children, your business, like all the people around you. But if you're in a place to speak openly about your use of psychedelics, I think in an elevated way, it's like the most impactful thing that can move that space forward. And especially if you're someone in a stigmatized world. Like my mom now, brief tangent, then I'll circle back. But like my mom they live in Georgia now. My parents live in Georgia. And my mom has had life-changing experiences with mushrooms. She's been a huge part of this whole, and she was very from the weed is the devil camp. Like this was a huge, huge turn. And there's a longer story there, but she's now sharing the benefits of psilocybin with like her tennis ladies at her Georgia, tennis clinic. And this is just, it's such an opposite mindset, but that's so impactful because she's someone that they resonate with. So
Totally.
yeah. And
exactly.
And I think that maybe a good, kind of direction to go from here. We kind of spoke about it a little bit before starting, but speaking about psychedelics within families, I heard, Lauren, who we mentioned, Lauren Taus, interview Rick Doblin, who is the founder of MAPS. I want to talk a little bit more about MAPS, but, they had a conversation at Burning Man, which I went and attended. I want to talk about Burning Man as well. So a few other pins that we'll circle back on. But the conversation was so interesting because, Rick was sharing his perspective on having conversations with your children, his children specifically around psychedelics and at what age, is appropriate to introduce psychedelics to them and just what that conversation should look like. And I think it's twofold, right? Like on one hand, you have informed parents that are aware of the psychedelic space that should have conscious conversations around substance with their kids. And then you have kid is the wrong word for it, but you have like adults that are having experience with psychedelics, then educating their parents. So any thoughts on like how to have those two conversations?
I mean, I think the answer to everything is always to be as like transparent and real as possible. And like so much of the problematic like drug education in the past was just not based in reality. And that's why people like, especially kids, didn't listen to it when they figured out it was bullshit, basically. But yeah, and I guess a lot of patience. I have more experience speaking to my parents about it than, I don't have children yet. But with my parents, it was just kind of patience and compassion for understanding like why they had the beliefs they did. I mean, I'm like, if they're listening to this, they'll probably laugh that I said compassion because I was definitely impatient, But, they both opened up in different ways. With my father, it was cool. And actually, my grandmother, who was also really skeptical, for both of them, what most opened them up, at first, was a topical cannabis cream because they kind of didn't believe that cannabis was, real medicine. And they were really surprised that this lotion could actually really help their pain. My grandmother couldn't believe it helped her back and
CBD cream is the gateway to people.
This had some THC in it. Okay. It was Papa and Barclays, which is cool because now fast forward, 7, 8 years, my dad was working with one of the founders of Papa and Barclays on something. So it's a super sweet. Yeah. So I think it was just patience. And I was really lucky that my parents were open to having different experiences with me with medicine. And I think that helped them understand what it was about. I think it can be hard sometimes if you don't have the experience yourself, but they also saw how things impacted me. So they were really worried, even though they're more supportive of things now, but they were not as excited when I told them I was going into rural Colombia to sit with Iboga. They definitely had some questions, but it was really cool speaking to them after. They said wow, your energy seems to, they could kind of tell by how it impacted me. They felt differently about it. And I think with children, especially now when psychedelics are becoming more normalized in culture, again, it's really about responsible use and intentional use. And that's again why I think these storylines in TV and movies are so important. I think a lot of young kids are first seeing psychedelic storylines that way. And it's often people whoops, I took acid by accident and had this crazy disaster of a trip. And I think that kind of teaches fear and kind of not how to be really careful about it. And I, hope that we're going to see more storylines where people are, maybe friends in nature, have intentions and maybe had something they were all working on together or, working through some conflict and kind of seeding other ways of doing it, showing how to test your drugs, to make sure that MDMA doesn't have other shit in it. Just, I think really making sure people feel armed with knowledge about how to do things safely. I think that just automatically helps people use in different kinds of ways. And and I think for children, there's a lot cannabis use hasn't increased in children as the legalization has moved forward. And I think that's really interesting. Kids, aren't necessarily if you kind of take the taboo out of it, sometimes that can kind of help. So kind of shining light in the shadows, I think actually helps with the kids not being as excited to use different substances too.
Definitely. I think, just naturally we all want what we can't have. So if you remove that, if you look at, just the drinking rates in Europe, how Europe treats alcohol versus how we treat alcohol, that's a great example of it. I'd love to talk about Burning Man. And this is the first conversation that I've had actually about Burning Man in a publicly recorded content setting because it's my first year at Burning Man and it was mind-blowing. I don't really want to focus on my experience. I'd rather focus on yours. I'm still processing mine, but it was mind-blowing and such a beautiful experience. And I found this article that I want to read. It was written in 2012 and I'm getting connected with the guy who wrote it because I think it was just so well done. And it was 5 lessons that you can take from Burning Man into your real life. And so I want to share this and see if you have any thoughts on it. And also just any thoughts you want to share on Burning Man, because I find it really interesting that you have, people that were in completely different avatars. I saw people that I know that are big public figures that are doing a very specific thing in the world, totally in a different version of themselves at Burning Man. And not because they were just high or out of their mind or dressed crazy. It was they were just fully expressed in a really beautiful way. And it's this whole wonderful world that it's created in this city. So anyways, this article says it's speaking around the fact that there is no default world. That's the point of it's not you go to the playa, Burning Man, and then you go back to the default world. It's the fact that the whole world is just one big world-size interactive art installation. Mm-hmm. It's all just a series of temporary encampments in which humans have, through their ingenuity and creativity, figured out how to interface with the wilderness and live together in clusters. Just like the street clock and open playa, the rest of the world is available to explore and interact with and play while wearing one costume or another, playing one role or another. There is no default world. So thoughts on this? Thoughts on Burning Man? You've been a lot. I'd love to hear.
Yes, that definitely resonates. Like for me, the most powerful parts of Burning Man are what you take out to your everyday life and outside of Burning Man. And it's such a fun, special time to be there. But like, it's to me, Burning Man isn't really about Burning Man, if that makes sense. So that super connects. Yeah, for me, my first burn, I think one of the most powerful things for me was like the experience of kind of validating my experiences of like synchronicity and kind of having things that I had experienced in my life, but have kind of been like, oh, that's crazy. Like, that's a crazy coincidence and hadn't really given much credence to. But in that space, you experience that at such a high frequency and also in shared spaces. So, like, 4 or 5 people experience it together. So it's kind of hard to deny. So that to me was like this kind of beautiful type of spirituality that I've really like kind of taken to the rest of my life and kind of seeing all of those magical patterns that I really appreciate. And I believe that part of the reason that happens at Burning Man is because so many people there are so kind of open-hearted and curious and like wanting that to happen or like open to it happening. And when you pass people, you smile, you say hi, you compliment each other, you give hugs. And I know that was one of my most jarring things after my first burn, like in 2014, going back to like New York when, making eye contact with someone on the subway and someone looking at me like I was crazy. And I was like, wow, like that's so sad, like that we've created a world that's actually so disconnected. And so trying to take that part back from Burning Man, like what is it like to smile more to strangers and to kind of share more, to gift more. Like people who don't go to burn think there's like barter system of like, no, they're gifting, like there's joy in gifting and sharing things. And, people see that, horrific line up leaving Burning Man, the like 7-hour line, which, the environmental sustainability things are a huge issue, which I'm happy to talk about separately. But when you're in that line, what like really struck me is like the vast majority of people like banging on our door, to say hi, we're offering stuff. Like, do you have enough water? Can I make you a sandwich? Can I roll you a joint? Like, like way more than that, than asking for anything. And I feel like outside of that context, if people were stuck in a 7-hour line, people would be like conserving their stuff and like not really, maybe some people would help, but I feel like it wouldn't be that like automatic impulse of like, we all got each other here. And yeah, so for me, that's just deeply powerful. But I've also thought a lot about how to take that outside of the playa. And in 2015, I co-founded something called Catharsis on the Mall, which was a vigil for healing from the war on drugs originally. But then we had them every year kind of about different issues. And it was basically a burn on the National Mall between the monument and the White House. And it was pretty amazing. It was free and open to everyone in DC. And it was all weekend. I mean, we had it, I think 5 years in a row. And it was really about taking the burn principles, making them accessible to everyone, and also engaging more in like, political issues or, I say political almost in quotes because everything really is political. So just kind of acknowledging that. And we did that by creating space for healing specifically around the war on drugs. And then the next year was Trump's election. So we actually focused that year on healing from the patriarchy. And we had this statue of a giant woman standing strong. And it was super powerful, like after Trump was elected, to like be there dancing all night. And we had a temple burn. We had the first burn in like 100 years on the mall that was that size. And yeah, so I'm really, and that temple was so powerful right when Trump was elected. The stuff that people wrote in that temple was like deeply powerful. So kind of for me, taking those principles and engaging and, kind of to that end, this year was our second year, but I was co-founded a camp at Burning Man called the Cosmic Camels with my dear friends from around the Middle East, or SWANA, Southwest Asia, North Africa. And it was just kind of added another level to our burn and what we were doing, and to kind of build this beautiful family with folks from all these countries that borders usually get in the way. And now we're able to like be in a space like Burning Man and play and build and live in a desert together.
Mm.
So yeah, that's kind of how I like to approach the burn. And yeah, there's, issues with it in a lot of ways. And, I don't in any way want to like dismiss the sustainability issue, because I think that's something we all could do a lot better. Burning Man org could do a lot better job of. But like, I don't know, the way people like kind of dismiss it as frivolous, to me, I think it's really one of the kind of core ways that we're gonna thrive as humanity. Not Burning Man itself, but like the kind of thing it represents, giving people space to play and experience joy. Because if we're not creating from those spaces of play and joy, we're creating from places like fear and sadness and anger, and we're going to keep recreating those same cycles. So if we want something different, we need to like create spaces where we can like be our full authentic self and express ourselves however we want. And, like the way that you said, people felt like they were their true selves, even if they felt really different from the so-called default world. But it's not like a costume. Like my mom's like, oh, how are your costumes? I'm like, it's not a costume. Like you're dressing like how you most want to be, like to dress, and feel like how you most feel yourself. So I believe like that's kind of where we need to get, and as a society, where people can be able to fully realize themselves that way. I think that's one of our best ways forward. So I think it's like deeply radical and important. But I also acknowledge that a lot of people at Burning Man are not quite approaching it with that level of intention, like flying in and out for like a day or two, and like kind of not dropping into that process. So, I don't know that it's like that for everyone, but I really believe in like what the potential of what it has to offer.
A teacher of mine that I've learned a lot from said that, as far as engaging with, and it's a parallel with psychedelic experience and Burning Man. So, as far as engaging with this, specifically ayahuasca, she's like, we don't need more people to necessarily like become ayahuasca shamans and serve medicine. We need people to come sit in ceremony and then take those lessons into the world. And that was really impactful for me, because after I sat with ayahuasca, it was a life-changing experience. I feel like any of these things are. And no part of me was like, oh, I want to, I didn't feel the call at all to like serve medicine or be more involved in like the actual ceremonial facilitation of that specific medicine. And I was asking about that, and she was like, the whole point, and some people do feel that call, which is incredible, but like what she was like, we need more of is for people to take these lessons from the cosmos, so to speak, and like implement them in the 3D. And I think Burning Man, like this article pointed to that really well. And so did everything you just said.
Totally. And, people ask me that a lot, like, oh, like I really want to get into space. Should I be like a psychedelic therapist? And I really think there's both what you said, like taking the psychedelic ethos into anything you do. And then there's also like in the psychedelic world, we need people who do every different thing. Like, but it's not only psychedelic therapists. We need a whole industry, a whole like ecosystem of people doing work and engaging. So I just want to make a point of that, because I know a lot of people are like kind of excited and looking in, and I feel like we need visionaries and co-creators and people that are building, more in this space.
What are your thoughts? So on that point, this is like one of my last questions around kind of the psychedelic stuff, and then I have a few other questions for you before we close it out. But there's a lot of finger pointing in the psychedelic space. There's a lot of debate amongst ketamine telehealth and psychedelic public companies and patents and people patenting the wrong things, and a lot of criticism amongst everyone. And I've had, not nearly as many conversations as you have, but a lot of different conversations for people across all different parts of the ecosystem: therapists, doctors, underground, above ground, investors, all of the different elements at play here, founders. The ones that I'm most excited to talk to aren't really focusing on the criticism of who's doing it's right or wrong. They're just moving their own part forward and then adjusting as they become more educated. Because a lot of it's naivete. Like if you don't know something about the way that you're speaking about, whether it's indigenous reciprocity or something else, oftentimes it's just because like you're not educated enough and you need better on your board. And I just want to, or if you're figurative or literal board, like, So just any thoughts on the whole industry as it's moving forward, thoughts on, the criticism, where should we be pointing, where we should be looking out for, and where would you kind of like to see it go? That's 12 questions in one, but
No. So I am excited because I see a huge potential opportunity with our new psychedelic industry to create a more trauma-informed, like healthy space. And I think it's not going to happen easily, but I am like heartened that most people at least seem open to it. And now I'm not like naive enough to think that that is enough to make it happen. And, I see a lot of people open to it, but like operating in very old ways and old paradigms. But I think, in my experience, a lot of the kind of organizers and activists who I align myself closely with often have criticisms I share. We have a lot of these businesses, but in their criticism often are like kind of screw those people. I don't even want to go to those conferences. Like I don't want to show up. They're doing all these things so badly. And I think that's like the big mistake is like giving up power. And so I really believe in like bringing the critique, with love, calling people in. And again, I don't want to be like naive in that. I don't think that's like going to work every time, but I do see an openness, and I am hopeful that we can kind of keep bridging these conversations because, right now it's not just these like few evil companies or investors. Like they're representing the greater world we live in and of the system of capitalism, and like they're just following all of these other companies, which I also think are doing like operating in harmful ways. But I think kind of holding compassion for that, while also holding people accountable and asking for psychedelic companies to do better and be better, and to acknowledge that this is not like we're focused on health and mental health, and we're see how other companies are literally destroying our planet and destroying our people. So I think it's really absolutely essential to be asking companies like what they're doing differently. And I think asking companies also beyond like, yes, it's great when companies are giving a portion of their income to, indigenous like allies or, different great causes. But that to me is like the most basic step. Like I want to know what you're doing fundamentally as a company that's not screwing over people in the country, and also what you're doing to like change the system in some way. Because if you're doing business as usual and then just giving some of your profits away, like, it's better than not giving your profits away, but that's not good enough in my estimation. So, yeah, and that's how I guess how I feel about the finger pointing. I think in the psychedelic way, I'd like to kind of call people in with love, and I'm saying that with a little chuckle because people who know me well know I'm pretty critical and definitely have like very strong opinions, and I don't shy away from sharing them. But I do think it's important to like share them with people and give people opportunity to make those changes. I also think it's interesting working at MAPS because we went from feeling like kind of the like underdog, but like very like grassroots, like, building this beautiful community around the world, to also now feeling like critiqued in different ways for like being, kind of almost because we've been successful and because we're so close to FDA approval. Now there's like critiques of like what we're doing, and even, we're operating as a nonprofit, but we're raising money in different interesting ways. So yeah, that's been an interesting journey. And yeah, maybe should I say a few words about like MAPS and where we're at? Or?
Yeah, I would love that. That was kind of one of the primary questions. We didn't get there, but like, people have to listen to the full episode to get to the good stuff. But can you explain what MAPS is and, and also your main focus there? And most people listening, if you're listening to the podcast, like you have awareness around MAPS. Most people do if they're familiar with psychedelics, but I would also love to hear your definition of it too.
So MAPS stands for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which is such a mouthful. But I love what it represents, and it really speaks to how we have a very holistic approach to our work. Rick Doblin founded MAPS 36 years ago, which it's really, we've been at it for a long time. Same year Burning Man was founded, by the way.
Wow.
So we've really like come up together, and we can speak more about that. But MAPS was founded to develop medical, legal, and cultural context for the safe and beneficial use of psychedelics, including marijuana. So that in that space, Rick, decided that first focus was on developing MDMA as a prescription medicine through the FDA process, because actually when MAPS was founded, it was founded after MDMA was first criminalized, because MDMA was not illegal. There was a period in the 70s and 80s where therapists were using it in couples therapy and for phobias. And then it kind of got caught up in the 80s war on drugs, hysteria. Someone took MDMA and added some speed to it and called it ecstasy and started selling it in Dallas on the club scene. And then it kind of use really skyrocketed and they clamped down. And then when they criminalized MDMA, Rick actually gathered a bunch of like faith leaders and researchers and doctors to protest the scheduling. And they had like a 2-year court case with the DEA where they proved that MDMA shouldn't be Schedule 1. And the DEA judge agreed and said, you're right, it shouldn't be Schedule 1. And then the head of the DEA said, I reject my own judge's ruling, it's criminalized. And then Rick was like, okay, we need to start MAPS and do rigorous MDMA research through the FDA system so that they can't do that. But what I really appreciated is he was always committed to not only doing the medical research, because he knew that was just one piece. So he always was working to end the war on drugs and also to do the kind of educational, cultural component. And other psychedelic researchers were a bit more like focused, like we're just going to do the academic research. And so that really was important to me that Rick had this broader approach. And now 36 years later, we're around a year out from having MDMA-assisted therapy for the treatment of PTSD to be approved by the FDA. And the FDA is working with us really closely. They gave us breakthrough therapy designation. So there's a lot of really strong indications like right now that it's going to happen. And yeah, we have really tremendous results from our first phases of research. And that's really MAPS's kind of primary focus, but that's kind of our the platform that we use to do education and policy reform as well. So yeah, I guess I'll speak a little because we spoke about Burning Man. Another beautiful project of MAPS is called the Zendo Project. And it's always been really essential for Rick because he views it as harm reduction for, if in a society where we're working to end the war on drugs and decriminalize all substances, we have to have ways of responding to people in crisis and supporting folks. So Zendo Project exists at Burning Man and other festivals for people having difficult psychedelic experiences, or honestly, often people come who are sober having a difficult experience just emotionally, or like integrating a psychedelic experience after. And they come to Zendo where there's people who are trained in peer support, and they hold space for people and sit and provide like kind of a quiet space and water and snacks. And it's just really important space, because people who can go from having a so-called really bad trip that becomes really traumatic to like actually processing it in a way that's like helpful and can hopefully help them move through something. And that's something that's, very like quote unquote risky, that maybe a certain company, a psychedelic development company would say, we would never want to do that. And so that's why I love the MAPS is like, we have to do that. We're committed to like, access for all, healing for all, which is also why we're committed to decriminalization, because in our country, in the US right now, like health, like if we're working in the healthcare system, it means not everyone will have access, unfortunately. So there's a lot of levels of that, but MAPS does really work. And what I'm really so proud of also is that our work is very global, and like it's really been focused on kind of community building for decades. And Rick is constantly traveling around the world, as are many of us, like going to different conferences, meeting different folks from all around the ecosystem and making connections. Like we talk about ourselves as switchboard operators and kind of incubators. And I think that's a really important role. And seeing when businesses are starting to develop in the space, that by rules of, capitalism, there's a lot around competition. And so it's really interesting as I'm starting to talk to more companies. I'm like, oh, have you talked to these people are also doing that? You should all talk. And they're like, what? Why would I talk to them? They're making competition. And I'm like, you're doing the same thing. You could learn, you could do complementary things. So I think that's something really interesting. Like MAPS is so like, we work with everyone, to a fault sometimes. Like you talked about pointing fingers. We get critiqued a lot because we work with people across the political divide and all different companies and all different things, because we really believe in being that bridge. But I think it's really essential. We also don't compromise on certain values. So like how to navigate being a bridge, but really staying firm to your values and your commitments. So that's something that's definitely interesting to continue navigating. But as psychedelics do expand more in a mainstream context, I think it's really important that folks stay engaged and don't just like point fingers and say like, I don't want to be kind of a part of that like corporate psychedelia, which trust me, I understand. It really pains me. I've been in this space a long time, and seeing the amazing people I know dedicate their lives to this and make no money, and like the people coming in after their first ayahuasca experience and making $1 billion, it's really painful. But I feel like the more people separate, the worse that's going to be for everyone involved. So it's hard work bridging things, but I'm hopeful that like in all spaces people will kind of be more open to those conversations. But I guess to the same end, like I believe you always kind of need the polarities in some ways, like the people that are really like planted on like one side of an issue or another, or things like that kind of like give ground for the space to build in between. So I kind of honor the role that everyone plays in that ecosystem too.
Thank you so much for that. I just learned a lot about MAPS, and there's pieces of that I was aware of, but it's one of the most prominent, if not, I would say the most prominent organization in psychedelics, at least in my view and a lot of people's view. And it's pushed the needle forward so much. And there's a lot. I mean, as you grow anything, you're going to get critics. So I think you're doing something right. If you're not getting critics, then you're probably not big enough. And I had one quick question. It's more of like a logistical question about Zendo Project, because I didn't get to visit it at Burning Man. I'm not even sure if it's something you like go to if you're not having an experience.
You probably can't like go inside, but you can kind of go to the outside where the volunteers are
okay,
hanging.
So it's also like a camp that people are like staying at, and then there's also like a facility.
Oh, like the camp where people stay isn't where people are received.
Right,
but
it's like a separate.
There's like volunteers outside kind of at all times. So if you're interested, like I wouldn't recommend 1 million people going by, but if you're like 1 or 2 people, you can kind of go by and talk to the volunteers who aren't like actively working.
My question that was specifically on the volunteering. I believe that I heard on a podcast, it was either like a Tim Ferriss or someone like that volunteered at Zendo camp or Zendo. Is that something that you need training to do? What's the process? If anyone that's listening, they're like, that's something I'd be interested in for next year.
I would definitely recommend the experience. You apply basically, and then Zendo provides training and support around that. There's like an online training and an in-person part. But it's amazing. We have so many people that wanted to do the work. So that's why like there's actually, I think we could only accept like maybe half or 60% of people who applied. I don't know the exact statistic, but that was just because we had so much support, which was wonderful. But there's, different opportunities throughout the year, and Zendo has a training online as well. So I really encourage people who are interested to learn and kind of start that in their own community. Like I believe every party, every rave, everywhere in that context where people are taking psychedelics should have a kind of Zendo-like corner with someone sitting and kind of holding space. So I think that's just a beautiful thing for like people to be responsible to learn how to sit and hold space. And I'll say one of the best, or not the best, but something that we say a lot, one of Zendo's like principles that it really resonates is difficult is not the same as bad. And it's really about like, so, kind of sitting with the difficult and about kind of sitting with, instead of like moving someone through it, just like being present with them as on their journey. But I think Zendo does a really beautiful job of kind of breaking down how to work with people in crisis also, which is not only for folks with psychedelics. So Zendo actually does some trainings with law enforcement because people who are having like psychiatric crises as well, like not including psychedelics, would still really benefit from kind of Zendo response rather than like handcuffing people or strapping people in, or like really horrific ways of responding to spiritual emergencies.
So Zendo is not just at Burning Man. It's something that is a year long. Do you guys potentially doing activations at other activations is the wrong word? Are you guys, holding space at other festivals? Is that something?
Yeah, Zendo has worked at a number of other festivals and has also trained people like in a bunch of other, like, in Africa Burn, or they worked with the team at Boom in Portugal and kind of helped set up a lot of programs. So they do trainings that way. But this year after the pandemic, there was some, like, I think we stopped going to other festivals besides Burning Man for right now. But there's Zendo social media and website. So if people are interested, I definitely recommend like staying abreast with what's going on.
There's so much more that I want to talk to you about, but I have a few final questions, and then we'll have to do another one at a later date. What is the most, exciting thing that you'd like to share in the next 6 months for you? Exciting things that are coming up, whether it's for you or for MAPS, anything that you want to share with people that are listening?
I'm trying to choose. I'm lucky there are like a few things that I'm excited about. Maybe I've kind of been talking a lot about this movie, or actually, you know what? This is what I'll talk about. Sorry. We, MAPS is hosting a giant conference in Denver in June 2023. We are inspired by like South by Southwest kind of energy. We're going to have 10,000 people for a week. And we have a giant convention center, but we're going to have events all throughout Denver, like all different activations, art spaces, parties, all different panels with people from like every different corner of the psychedelic space. So it's a lot of work, but I'm really excited because it's like a gathering of everyone, hopefully, like really, of course, not everyone, but we really hope that a lot of the people who are really kind of spending a lot of time in their life right now working on psychedelics are going to be kind of coming together to ask some really big questions, figure out some things. We talked about this finger pointing and like where this industry is going. And also I think it's just really fun and generative. So I'm also really excited in the lead up to that to be working with our amazing community to be co-creating. Like I'm already having so many people pitch like the coolest different things and kind of figuring out how that all fits together. So I guess that's something like a call like put out that if people are inspired and like want to co-create with us, to definitely reach out. We have so much conference space, like there's so much to do, like talking to different artists about making really cool big art installations like within the space, but also like cozy, tea hang areas, because there's going to be so many panels and people are going to need hangout areas in between and little spaces to have like yoga and so that's a beautiful thing to get to kind of like be brainstorming around constantly. And it's exciting to me right now. And I guess also exciting to me to be able to develop some meaningful conversations, because I feel like a lot of the conferences these days, not all of them certainly, but a lot of them are like not having panels that are kind of asking some like deeper questions. They're kind of, because it's beautiful, so many new people are coming into this space. I feel like there's kind of a lot of like high level stuff rather than like drilling in. So MAPS will have both, but I'm excited to kind of get into some of the meaty, hard questions, hopefully.
Amazing. I believe that my team is talking to your team about participating in some way with Supermush.
I have to be there.
Yeah, yes. No, I'm so excited to attend and participate and support in all the ways. So I'm very excited. Last question for you is, we ask everyone this at the end of the episode, but what is the most important lesson that psychedelics have taught you?
I was bad at like choosing one thing. Let's see. Something that's coming up for me right now, so I'll go with it, is they've helped me kind of learn about like embodiment and like listening to my body and connecting to my intuition, or things that I might have like spoken about before but didn't have more like tangible understanding of what that meant. Like I loved dancing my whole life, but didn't realize till after my psychedelic experiences, like the deep kind of embodied spiritual practice that dancing is. And there's this beautiful Rumi quote about you dance when you're most broken down and sad and in despair, and you also dance when you're most happy and exulting. And so I think that, to me, like, psychedelics played a really big role in kind of helping me like make that connection. And I think in a world that we're so, at least myself, I'm so in my head, and doing, policy work was very in my head, and having to travel and talk to a lot of people and be up in that space. It's a really important practice for me to be able to come back to my body and ground into that and drop into like my inner knowing from that space rather than from that other element. So grateful for them for that.
Where can people find you? They want to follow up. I will obviously post everything in the show notes of this, but best place to get in touch with you.
I guess they can follow me on Instagram at Natalie Lila, NatalielyLyla. Yeah, that's probably the best place just to keep up with the different, I share different things that I'm up to and different events and all sorts of things about psychedelics there.
Amazing. I'm so glad you came on. I learned so much from this conversation, and I'm really excited for all the work that you're doing. So thank you for everything. You've obviously been in this space for a very long time. And I think it's some of the most important work in the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun and so important, such important work you're doing, hosting such beautiful conversations. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for diving into the multiverse with us. If you're interested in being a featured guest on the show, sponsorship, partnership, or you're just mushroom curious, we're always looking to expand our mycelium network. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Into the Multiverse, where you can find clips from this podcast, psychedelic legalization news, events that we're doing, and so much more. In addition, we've also created the world's first ever mushroom-specific marketplace called The Multiverse, which you can find on Instagram at Multiverse or online at yourmultiverse.com. We've also created our own in-house consumer lifestyle brand called Supermush. We make mushroom mouth sprays. We make a whole line of mushroom streetwear. You can find it on Instagram at Supermush or online at supermush.com. We'll see you next week. Much love.